Hi everyone, please take your seats. We're about to begin.
Hello, bonjour. My name is Grace Van Vliet, and I'm one of your MCs today. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts, welcome to our Ryerson Democracy Forum.
Hello, my name is Aidan Kerr, and I'm co-hosting today's event with Grace. We're both in charge here, so please be aware of that. We're in charge of the politicians, we're in charge of the fellow students, and for the first time I think ever, we're in charge of the professors here as well, so we're a little bit excited about that. Before we begin, a really important message for everyone. We have a lot of media here today, so please switch your phone to silent, but don't turn them off, as we would like you to tweet about the event here using the hashtag RUVoting2018. That's capital R, capital U, voting 2018.
To begin, Ryerson's Special Advisor on Indigenous Education, Hayden King, will deliver the opening acknowledgement.
Anin Bojo, Bidwewo dem Indigenous Magizi and Dodem, Chimnasing and Donjaba, Anishinaabe and Dao. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty negotiated originally by the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to protect the land and speak for the land in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Subsequent Indigenous nations, communities, many newcomers now live and work in the dish and are expected to honor these obligations. This acknowledgement is not static. It's not meant to be hollow or superficial or trivialize Indigenous sovereignty, which it often does. Rather, it compels action. So what is Ryerson doing to honor these obligations? And more importantly, how do the leaders of each of these parties who presume to govern this province on Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, and Mushkegowuk territories plan to honor these obligations? Miigwech Wendam Genawea, Ahau.
Thank you. And now our President, Mohamed Lashemi, will bring greetings on behalf of Ryerson University.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to Ryerson Democracy Forum. I would like to extend a very special welcome to our campus, to our honored guests, Premier Kathleen Wynne, Leader of the Liberal Party, Vic Fedeli, Interim Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, Andrea Horwath, Leader of the New Democratic Party, and Mike Schreiner, Leader of the Green Party. Thank you also to Martin Cohen and his team for putting spotlight on democracy. 25 years ago, just when Ryerson University became officially a university, the future for democracy was very bright, led by the transformation, if you remember, of Eastern Europe. The spread of democracy seemed inevitable. 25 years later, we can ask what happened. Countries that were once healthy democracies are backsliding. Even in countries with a long democratic tradition, there is cynicism, social division, and apathy among voters. Given the headlights, today's forum could not be more timely. The message to Canadians and Ontarians is clear. We cannot take our democracy for granted. It needs our constant attention. Right now, many young people don't feel that our institutions and political systems have place for them. Minority groups and women see barriers to full participation in the mechanism of power. There is where universities have an important and time-honored role. Universities are and should be the places where we can openly debate issues of the day, brainstorm solutions, and test ideas. Today's forum is a wonderful sign that students like you are interested in tending to our democracy, making sure it is vibrant and relevant. And I want to thank the 4 party leaders for being here this afternoon. Your thoughts on renewing our political process should give us all reason for great optimism. Thank you very much for being here. Merci beaucoup.
We're almost ready to begin, but first our job is just to lay out some rules so that everyone is on the same page. Premièrement, j'aimerais expliquer les règles dont tout le monde est en accord. We're all here to learn more about today's topic, which is democratic engagement, and we want to do this in a respectful way. This is not an election debate, and it is not a contest. It's a democracy forum, and we're trying to learn from everyone here. So we're asking the audience to please avoid any rah-rah partisan cheering, because it's not about winners or losers.
In the second hour at 4 o'clock, we will have top campaign strategists from each party come on stage to take questions from the audience. We'll tell you more about that later, but start thinking of your questions for part 2. If you're in the overflow section right now, hang in there because some seats may open up at 4 p.m. And remember to use our hashtag RUVoting2018. That's capital R, capital U, voting 2018. Okay, so our time with the leaders on stage is very tight, so let's get going.
For the first hour, the 4 party leaders will discuss their own ideas about democratic engagement with our moderator, Martin Reg-Cohn. Martin is a Toronto Star columnist who writes about provincial issues. He is also a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Arts, and he is the organizer of today's event. So he will now introduce our guests. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Aidan. Let's get right to this and hold any applause until we're done. You already know, to my right is Premier Kathleen Wynne. Beside her is the Leader of the Opposition, Vic Fedeli, an interim leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. Next is Andrea Horwath, Leader of the Ontario NDP. And to the far left, I don't know what that means for you, is Mike Schreiner, Leader of Ontario's Green Party. So please welcome the leaders of Ontario's 4 biggest parties. They are so polite. We're off to a good start. And I have to note that while I was being introduced, the 4 leaders here were kind of snickering and giggling about the idea of me being introduced. And it's kind of a role reversal. But this is about you. It's unprecedented to have all 4 political leaders on stage like this, and I'm very grateful. It's unusual for them to be sitting down with each other and actually talking to each other and talking to university students, instead of talking at each other. And so thank you for doing that and participating in this Ryerson Democracy Forum. Remember, this entire conversation is off the record, so there's no tweeting. I'm kidding. This is actually thanks to CP24, which is carrying this, and also the star.com, and it's being live streamed on Ryerson as well. So we're all here because we're interested in democratic engagement. The challenge, though, I think for all of us, is for the people who aren't here and how to reach them, people who aren't listening, aren't engaging, and aren't voting. Voting day is on June the 7th, as you are all painfully aware. They're all nodding on that one because they're memorizing the countdown, roughly 100 days to go on June the 7th. So electioneering is top of mind for you, but not for most people in Ontario. So we all know that turnout generally is down in Ontario. Youth turnout is low, and turnout among new Canadians is low as well. But the bottom line is it's down for everybody. So a quick opening round to all of you. How serious is this a problem for you as politicians? And whose fault is it, and what can you do about it? Premier Wynne.
Well, thanks a lot, Martin, and thank you for, as President Latchme said, shining a light on this, because I think it's a really important conversation. If I think about my own life, my grandmother didn't get to vote till she was 30 years old. So, you know, you wouldn't have dared not vote in our household. And I think that the issue of what are we taking for granted is one that we really have to think about. Having said that, I think sometimes people feel that voting doesn't matter, that their vote's not going to make a difference. And I can tell you, having lost my first election by 72 votes, every single vote matters. Every vote matters and can change the tide. So I think that we have a shared responsibility to your question. I think all of us are in this together, and so as politicians, we need to do everything we can to engage people. That means things like this, things like town halls, things like knocking on doors and actually talking to people. When a young person comes to the door and says to me they're not going to vote, I go in, you know, I go into well, if you don't vote, then somebody who looks like me is going to vote for you. And that is, you know, that is exactly what happens. Older people vote. And I think then the other thing is we need to look at what are the structural changes that we need to make? So we're working with Student Vote, for example, to register young people before they get out of high school. I think universities, that's a good time to have this conversation, but the better time is much earlier, so that kids get an understanding of why it's important that they take part. So I think we've got a shared responsibility.
Let's circle back to some of those thoughts later on, but Mr. Fedeli, I assume that politicians have been doing many of those things for many years. So what needs to be done differently? And by the way, feel free to blame the media for this as well. You can go ahead and take
that. Don't worry, Mark. We'll get to that, I'm sure. It's in note number 4. Your column the other day where you talk about voter apathy makes losers of everyone. I actually brought the printed copy as well, because we actually bought one, you know. But the point the point that I bring it out I bring it out because not only online, but in the printed version, there's a photo here, and it's of somebody who's a returning officer in this long series, a room-long series of cardboard boxes. And that, to me, is exactly part of the issue. When you think about voting today, right now, it's you have to get to a voting place. You're either going to take transit or drive a car and park or get there somehow, walk. You're going to go to a building you've probably never been to before. You're going to get in a line with people you've never met before, a long line in some cases. You're going to finally get up there, bring out paper ID and register. You see where I'm going with this. You're going to be handed a ballot. You'll get in a cardboard box, and there's a pencil, and you're going to fill out your ballot and hand it to somebody who's going to put it in another box. So what I'm trying to say is you're really not reflected in the modern, the way you actually work is not reflected in the way our government system has you voting. You're not reflected in that. You work with tablets and electronic voting, and the way you work is completely different than the way our system is set up. And I'll make one more very quick point. For instance, online petitions. You will go online and think you're doing the right thing, and you've got this great group, this groundswell of online petitions. We in the legislature, we can't accept them. Our system is you must have paper and live ink on a petition or it can't be accepted. How is that inviting to you to be able to come into our place with your ideas when we can't accept them and we give you this old technology? So in one word, modernize.
So Mr. Fedeli is trying to take the change space, the change candidate today, and Ms. Horwath, you may have preempted everyone here. Your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Martin, for putting this together. I think the format's a really good one because it's more about our ideas and what we're thinking about and more engaging, I think, than one of the other traditional things we do in campaigns, which is those pretty stuffy debates. But nonetheless, I'm really happy to be here. When I think about what's happening in our electoral system and what's preventing people from getting engaged, for me, I get the sense that people don't feel like they can make a difference anymore, that every time they vote, they get the same old results, and they're choosing between the same old things, and they don't really see an opportunity for change to occur. And I think when you look carefully at some of the instances in the last number of years where we've seen a bit of an increase in voter participation, it's because people actually think they can make change happen. And so the last federal election was like that. We had an election in BC, we had an election in Alberta, and in those instances, people actually wanted to go to the polls because they thought they could make life better, right? They thought they could do something different for a change. And I think that's a big part of it as well. It's about listening to what people have to say and reflecting their hope for the future and giving them something to actually vote for a change. And that's what I think is a big part of the puzzle as well.
Ms. Horwath made the point that there was an uptick, a rare uptick in the last federal election in 2015, but that's because Justin Trudeau talked about legalizing cannabis. And so youth voters responded to that because something was put on the shelf. But I think that was the low-hanging fruit, and he has already harvested that. And
but what about BC and Alberta? I mean, let's face it, those guys were talking about that.
I don't think there's much left on the shelf because we'd have to go up to cocaine and heroin, and I don't think we can do that. But Ms. Horwath did mention BC, and that a little light went off for Mike Schreiner because the Green Party has won seats in BC. Mr. Schreiner, what can you do differently?
Well, first of all, Martin, thank you for hosting this forum, and thank Ryerson for hosting the forum as well. And I agree, it's important for us to have, I think, a collegial conversation about democracy, so thank you for that. And I think the Green Party actually has a vested interest in voter turnout going up, because whenever Greens are elected, it tends to be in elections where voter turnout are record highs. And I think it comes to Andrea's point about people's desire for change and feeling like they have an opportunity for their voice to be heard. And you asked, who do we blame for disengagement? I think the media, politicians, and the way we conduct politics has to share in some of the blame. And one of the ways in which I really want to highlight that is I am deeply concerned about our civil discourse in terms of how we refer to voters. And so think of some of the media tropes that are out there. We talk about taxpayers a lot, as if we're only taxpayers. Or we talk as if voters are there to harvest votes, or that we're consumers of government services, rather than actually talking about people as citizens. And I think all of us need to start having a dialogue where we talk about people as citizens. And as citizens, we have rights and responsibilities. And some of those rights are the right to vote, but we also have responsibilities to engage in the political system and in the political process in multiple ways in addition to voting. And I think that's critically important as we think about how we engage and empower people to be more active participants in our political process.
Thank you. Very civil. Now the gloves are coming off, though. So I want to sharpen the focus a little bit and talk about just how bad things are and ask ourselves what we can do differently. So back in 1971, I was still born. I think everyone on stage probably was already around, but some students perhaps not. But the turnout in that Ontario election was 74%. Not bad. 3 out of every 4 voters. In 2011, we had only 48% of people in Ontario voting, less than half. And in 2014, it was 51%, barely improving, still roughly half. So we asked a research firm, Campaign Research, to take a look and ask people what they thought of that. If you thought about the fact, because it's not well known that only half of voters actually turned out, does that call into question the legitimacy of that elected government? And we found that 62%, about 6 out of 10 people in Ontario, questioned the legitimacy of the government when they found out that so few people were turning out. Now, maybe some of them weren't actually voting, so it's their own fault, but even so. So let me start with Ms. Horwath. You actually ran in both of those elections. Mm-hmm. How serious is that? Is there a crisis of legitimacy, do you think, if roughly half of voters are turning out?
Well, I mean, I think we have to, I think that's what this conversation is about. I mean, this conversation is very much about that very issue. But I have to say, I think there are ways that we can get people more engaged, and particularly young people more engaged in politics. I believe that young people are very tuned in to what's going on around the world, not just here in Ontario, but around the world. I think young people, more than ever before, are interested in global affairs as well as local affairs. And the key, I think, is to make sure that we're not just talking at them, but we're listening to them. We're engaging them in solutions and making sure that we're finding the space to do that work. And look, I mean, there's no doubt that I think everybody's talked to just a young person who said that they're simply they're not voting. But I think if we're honest about why, it's because we're not reflecting their hopes and dreams. Look, I have a son who's 25 years old, and he doesn't have a full-time job, and he's living in my basement. And I know that lots of other young people are worried about their future, worried about what's coming up for them. Are they going to be able to buy a home in the neighborhood where they grew up? Are they going to be able to afford to be able to rent, even in this city, particularly in other cities as well? What's happening to our environment? How are we going to stem, the big issues around our carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions? And these are the things that we need to engage young people on. Yes, it's about tuition and those kinds of things as well. It's about some of the bread and butter of getting through school, but it's also about some of the bigger picture issues. And I think we sell young people short when we don't make that attempt to pull them in. So we've tried to do that. Our party, you can vote at 14 years of age in the NDP. You can vote on policy issues. You can vote for leaders. You can do all of that, and we do that on purpose. We try to have an active youth group to not only talk about issues about when they become old enough to be leaders, but to say to them, you're leaders now. You're leaders now. We want your input, your advice, your insights now as a young person, not just at some point in the future, not just patronizing you that at some point in the future, you're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. And I think we do that too much to young people.
Well, both of my daughters are 14, so you might have made a sale today, and you can...
Party too. It's the same age.
So can I just... Yes, I was going to ask Premier Wynne, because you won the last election, and you won it fair and square. Do you have any sort of, to the original question, any sense of, does it bother you at some level that only half of the electorate turned out?
Well, I think to go back to my original comments, this is a subject that concerns me. I mean, it concerns all of us. I think that people, young people and older people, feel disengaged. But I wanted to build on something that Andrea said. For years, and I was definitely around in 1971, and for years we have heard older people say, kids aren't engaged, or they're not interested in the issues of the day. If we look at what's happening right now in the States with the young kids who are rising up around gun control, I mean, and those, that's a statement of how engaged kids are. Kids are concerned about issues that affect their lives. And the mistake we make, I think, sometimes, and maybe often, is that we lay out the range of things that we think people should be interested in, and from on high we say, these are the issues that are very important, without, as Andrea said, going to people and listening to what they are saying. And so kids are very engaged, but they're engaged in the things that they're concerned about. And so that's why it's important that parties have, as we do and as the other parties have, youth components that are integrated into the party, and that we listen to them, and that we do that riding by riding. But it's not enough, because if we look at that trajectory from 1971, there's been that downturn, and that's the broader issue. So it's not just about change, it's not just about a particular issue, it's about what are the structural problems that we're dealing with.
Mr. Fedeli, I'll come to you in a minute, but I wanted to just, again, sharpen the focus a little bit, because what's really bizarre about Ontario is that our democratic deficit is worse than any other government, any other province in Canada or federally. We are behind even Alberta on electoral turnout. And I think Ms. Horwath mentioned that students are so interested in global affairs, but why aren't they interested, if I can be parochial for a moment, in provincial affairs? Because, it's my pep talk, Ontario is in charge of post-secondary education. It's in charge of hospitals, police, carding issues. They all lie at the door of the Ontario government. Road building. My kids can recite all these issues because it confounds me. Nuclear reactors, you mention it. You say it. So why is there such a blind spot for Ontario? Mr. Fedeli, you're the newest leader on deck today. Why does Ontario get a pass for most voters?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, thank you, Martin, for the question. I'm the newest leader. I've been leader for 32 days, and I have 10 more days to go, and I will no longer be the leader. So let's just put that in context. I have 10 more glorious days, Martin, and that's it. In the last question, I talked about the fact that young professionals, they don't see themselves reflected in the structure. But here, when you look in the legislature, they also don't see themselves reflected in the politicians today. Now, of course, we do have one exception right now with Sam Oosterhoff. Sam Oosterhoff was 19 years old and was elected the youngest MPP in the history of our province. Today, he is still the youngest. He's turned 20 now. We had his birthday at a retreat in Timmins, but the next youngest is your MPP Yvonne at 38 years old. So they just don't see themselves reflected. And in your column, Martin, by the way, Sam has two messages, and one was very similar to yours, Premier. He said, "If I can tell you, if Vic, tell them two things from me, please." Ridings, the elections are so close, 72 votes you talked about. He said some are 50 to 60 votes. If you think for a moment that your vote doesn't count. To reinforce your point, that was his. In North Bay, my hometown, in the last federal election, 19 votes. 19 votes changed the course of, that could change the course of a minority or a majority government. Right? That's what's happening. So that's one message from Sam. The other is how he got elected. He said, tell him, I knocked on doors for 2 years, left my brochure and a handwritten Post-it note that said, hi, I'm Sam Oosterhoff, and I'm sorry I missed you. And he stuck it in their door. He wanted that message to get out to you as well. But Martin, in your column, you talked about a third of people don't vote because they think, this is, I presume from campaign research, because they don't think they're registered. And I thought a lot about that last night, thinking after I read the column, why? I'm guessing, and it's only anecdotal, that if they're not, a member of the NDP or the Green Party or a Liberal or a Conservative or another, if they're not a registered member of a party, perhaps that's why they don't think they have the right to vote.
That's why the voter registration in that process is important, and to get at it when kids are young, so that they are then introduced to the process.
Yep. You're a former Minister of Education, Ms. Wynne. Is there a room for more civics education? I don't like that word, but more talking about democracy, let's call it. Maybe that's the course heading. Talking about democracy.
There's a need for better civics education. We actually have a civics course, but it is very dependent on the quality of the particular teacher. The curriculum, I think, needs to be changed. And young people have said that to us, and we are revamping that curriculum. But can I just make a comment on the Ontario? One of the interesting things about this confederation of ours is that Ontarians, which is a word that we kind of don't use a lot, but it comes up. We use it way less than you hear Albertans, for example, and there's a reason for that. People in Ontario think of themselves as Canadians and then as Ontarians. Whereas if you go to other parts of the country, I have a young staffer who is from BC, and she said when she moved here, she was surprised at all the Canadian flags and all the Canada stuff when she moved to Ontario, because she had come from BC. She thought of herself as a British Columbian. Albertans think of themselves as Albertans. Maritimers think of themselves as Maritimers. But Ontarians, we kind of think of ourselves as Canadians, which is the arrogance born of being Upper Canada, I think. But that may actually play into some of the media's preoccupation with things they're not Ontario, and with people's sense of their obligation. We have an obligation to the federal because we're Canadians, but an Ontarian, that's not necessarily top of mind.
And they give me questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I don't want to lose the issue of voter registration, because I think that we've gone backwards in Canada, frankly, losing enumeration. And when I read your column, Martin, and I did read it, when I read your column, you talked about that same issue that Vic raised, which is one of the things that I was paying attention to. And the fact is, we don't even give people the heads up that there's an election coming, which enumeration used to do. It was almost like your first invitation to vote, right? You get the first invitation to vote because somebody shows up and actually puts you on the list. And then you can vote. So I think that ended in 1997 or so. And I really believe that might be an investment that we need to reconsider as an investment in our democracy, to begin to do enumeration again. And there are voters lists, and I don't know if you've seen them, but I have, where you go to a door and there's not just one family listed, there are 3 people in this family, 2 people in this family, another family of 4, all at the same address. The voters lists are not in good shape, and if we're serious about our democracy and making sure that it's working for us and for people, we should be enumerating again. I really think it's an important piece.
I'll come to you in a minute, Mike, because I do have a follow-up that I want to pin you down on. But that's something you can tell Jagmeet Singh now that he has abandoned Ontario politics for the big city in Ottawa. Enumeration is something that people talk about a lot. I think we need to find a new word for it, though, because if you're a young person, you probably have never even heard of enumeration. So registration maybe is an Americanism. Mike, I want to ask you, everyone's talking about young people, but we need to understand more about what's going on. When you look at the research, it shows that voting patterns are correlated mostly to educational attainment. Mm-hmm. And yet young people today are more educated probably than anyone else in the population with their masters and their PhDs and all that. And yet, as we know, their turnout is often the lowest. Now, maybe that's because they have a special course credit that gives them a higher BS meter, and so they are more attuned to what to watch for and what to tune out. But Mike, you are all about Mr. Schreiner, I'm sorry. You are all about the environment. You're the green guy here today, and that's what young people say they want all the time. But they don't vote for you. Now, we're not going to pick on you about that, but if they're not voting for anybody, it's a shared problem, not just your problem.
Well, actually, a lot of young people do vote Green, and I spent a lot of time on the University of Guelph campus talking with students, and I think part of the challenge is removing the barriers for young people to vote. And one of those barriers is the voters list. I think a lot of university students, in particular university and college students, are confused about where to vote. Do I vote in where my parents live? Do I vote where I go to university or college? And so there's a lot of confusion. So I would say that 1, we need to improve our voter lists. 2, we need to make sure that we do Elections Ontario does a lot of education on university and college campuses to inform students of how they vote, where they vote, those types of things. I think we need to look at actually lowering the voting age to 16. And because if you think about it, that's when that's when your grade 10 civics class is taking place. I talk in a number of high schools. High school students are incredibly engaged in politics and on issues. That's when they're the most engaged during civics. And once you establish that voting habit, that becomes a lifelong voting habit. And I think at 16 is a great age to do that. And then you're on the voting list for sure, and you lose some of this confusion. And then the final point I want to make, and this is one about the way in which politics is done. Increasingly, politics is data-driven. And it's driven by how do you mobilize your identified vote. And a lot of young people are not identified as party voters yet. And so I think it's incumbent upon political parties to not only look at motivating their base or motivating their identified voters, but to look at engaging and motivating all people to go vote.
I think the students will probably tell us that we're never going to get rid of data because they were born in the age of data. But let me go quickly to Premier Wynne. What do you believe is the special challenge for young people? You don't have a special advisor the way Mr. Fedeli does, a 19-year-old in your caucus. But we'll come back to Mr. Fedeli in a moment. But is it not cool to be involved in politics? Is there something about the cynicism, or what do you worry about?
I actually think, Sam sent us a message through Vic, and that was the personal connection. I've had the experience multiple times when I've run in Don Valley West, after I ran as a school trustee, but when I ran as an MPP, of going to high school debates and being only me and the Green candidate showing up. And it's like, that makes no sense to me. And so the point I'm making is that personal contact is really, really important. And I know you're going to probably get to the social media question, but I would have a question for the young people in this room, which is, if you're looking at videos that take 7 seconds, and how do we get our message to you? I don't know whether social media is a panacea, whether it's the answer, or whether we need to look at some of the more traditional outreach that actually Sam, who is the youngest member in the legislature, seems to be talking to. But we have a lot of, in our conversations around this in our party, we have a lot of concerns about how do we actually make sure that young people are getting the message when social media seems to be the tool of communication. And I know we're not supposed to have questions from the floor or comments from the floor, but I don't know if there's someone in the room who thought they would like to ask a question.
We have 4 leaders here and only about 14 minutes, so we're going to try to keep on pace. But the question to Mr. Fedeli and Ms. Horwath about, and I know Vic, you had a comment on this, but let's marry the two questions. Let's talk about new Canadians, because there is a challenge there, an opportunity, to use the old cliche, where new Canadians are not turning out in the same numbers. And the major reason that they tell us in the polling data from campaign research is that they don't think they're registered and they don't have enough information about party platforms. And Mr. Fedeli, you were first out of the gate with the Progressive Conservatives to have a platform, and then you had to move. It's suspended. Until,
you had to go there, right? You had to go there.
Until further notice. But that's not your fault, so you don't have to defend that. But we know that, for example, in the 905 and ridings in Brampton and Peel, all over Peel region, that there are a lot of high concentrations of new Canadians with lower turnouts in that riding. So what is it about trying to reach out? Your party, Mr. Fedeli, despite my teasing you about the platform, under your predecessor, Patrick Brown, made enormous strides in outreach with new Canadians, and no one can deny that. So what did you discover, and how did that work out?
So I want to make 3 points then, and 2 points, and I'll get to the new citizens. So on the first point, it was interesting in your column, and you repeated it. You had talked about the fact that in 2011 there was 48%. But think about it, in 2011, that 48%, it was an October election, and that meant the university students were in, and the polling booths were at virtually every university, including Nipissing University in my hometown. And so 48% in 2011, 2014, now we're in the June election, universities are out, and we had 51%. So I don't know how that marries.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the fact that I would have thought that the October election with the university polling booths right there, you can't miss them, would have been a remarkably higher turnout. So that's something I just don't understand yet. It's a point I just wanted to make that I don't understand.
It's a question of where the students are registered too, right?
Well,
and where they think they can vote.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
So the next point then is also in your article. I did memorize it, Martin. I want you to know that. Is about GOTV, or get out the vote. And so we live with these myths, right? We have myths. Young people don't vote. Seniors vote Tory. So what do? Our get out the vote goes, and we get out the seniors, because that's our myths that we continue to perpetuate ourselves. Well, we get out the seniors. Boy, look at the statistics. Seniors voted for Tories. Well, of course, we got them out. And so that's part, all of us tend to do that. We go after, and so it makes this vicious cycle, and that's a concern as well. And with respect then to new citizens, I think what you've seen Andrea do, and I'm sorry?
That's fine.
and the Premier, and Mike as well, and other parties, what you see us at the Gurdwaras, you see us at the Vietnamese Tet celebration, you see us out there doing that. We're trying to build trust. And I think that's what all parties are doing equally well, Martin.
Horwath, you've mentioned to me before that was one of your personal challenges because, in fairness, the NDP was pretty white. How have you made out?
Oh, we've made out smashingly. But look, I mean, this is it though. I mean, like any other party, you have to invite people. So when we're talking about new Canadians, we're talking about people from racialized communities, you have to invite them and then make sure that they feel welcomed, that you actually make room for them. And certainly when I became the leader of the Ontario NDP, that was one of the missions that I took on, and I'm proud of the work that I was able to do. And I can say that there's a reason why we have the first ever Sikh person who's a leader of a major political party nationally. And that's because Jagmeet Singh did the work that he did with us as a caucus. I took him under my wing, and I helped him with some of the learning around what you do as a leader. And he was my deputy leader for a number of years, and now he's the very first. And I think that's an amazing piece that I was able to be a part of, and that Jagmeet is able to reflect the communities that we have. And so I think that's the other big thing. Every government, whether it's school board, whether it's municipal, whether it's provincial, whether it's federal, the people sitting around those tables making decisions should reflect the community. That is our responsibility. And so, for example, we at the NDP had the first ever caucus of more than 50% women in the history of Ontario, in the history of the country. The first ever caucus that had more than 50% women. We have now about 55% women candidates. We have about 26% racialized candidates, about 4% Aboriginal candidates, and our candidate slate is not filled. But since I've been leader, I've worked really hard, and we have processes in place that force our ridings to do the outreach, to invite people in, to say, yes, you can be a candidate for us, and we want you to be a candidate for us. And it's not something that's just going to happen. You have to do that work. And sometimes I can tell you as leader, I'm the one that often engages with people. I'll call somebody up, or I'll be at an event, and somebody will be quite impressive, and I'll suggest to them, have you ever considered running? And I think it's something to do with what Vic talks about a little bit in terms of who we're accustomed to talking to, but it's also who's accustomed to being asked and who isn't. And so oftentimes as leader, I've talked to women who are amazing, or people from racialized communities who have got so much in terms of credentials and experience and lived experience, and they don't feel that they can do it, or that they have the credentials or the qualifications. But those kind of, no offense to anybody, but those middle-aged white guys, you give them a chance and they're there chomping at the bit. They think that that's their entitlement, right? They belong there. They belong there. I think we all belong there, and I think it makes our democracy much healthier when we look at our tables of government, when we look at the places of power and where decisions are made, that our communities are reflected very clearly there.
But we let Jagmeet Singh get away to Ottawa, so now we've got to fight
Yes, we did let him
here.
get away.
So,
I think we all agree with that, and I think that outreach is critical. And look, 30% of our caucus was not born in Canada. So we I think all of us agree that it's important. I think the next step is that we make sure that we don't trivialize those relationships, so that I represent one of the most diverse ridings in the country, and the issue that when I canvassed in Thorncliffe Park and Flemington Park in 2003, when I was first running as an MPP, the issue was not a cultural issue, it was rent control. Rent control was the most important issue that I heard from all of those people from different backgrounds. That was the theme. And so I think we need to bring people in because of their varied life experience, and that's really, really important, but not boil those relationships down to, these are people from different backgrounds, therefore our job is over. We have to make sure that we hear the issues that are affecting their lives, not because they're Sikh or any particular background, but because they are people who are struggling with issues here in the province.
Really quickly, because I agree 100%. And yes, it's important, for example, for the anti-racism secretariat to be up and running and to take responsibility for systemic racism that continues to exist. It was important to have Islamic Heritage Month brought forward in our province, but we can't put people in boxes and define them by that. They're worried about what's happening in their children's schools. They're concerned about whether their kids are going to get a job. They're worried about the overcrowding in hospitals. They have all of the same kind of concerns that everybody else has. And then there are other things as well that we have to acknowledge that we need to work on to make sure that they can experience life in Ontario as equally to everyone else and as fully as everyone else, including in politics.
Because those are the issues when you go to those doors.
Sure,
that's what they want to talk to you about.
Can I just add a wonderful example? So we had Sahir Shafiq, who is a activist with the Muslim Get Out the Vote effort speak at our convention just a few weeks ago in Guelph. And the story of their success is incredible. In the 2011 federal election, 46% of Muslims voted. In the 2015 federal election, almost 79% voted. And it was directly due to their efforts, the community's efforts to make sure people were on the voters list, to make sure people realized how important it was to go out and vote, where to vote, if they needed help going out to vote. And so I think that's a role that Elections Ontario could potentially play in reaching out to communities of new Canadians to just let them know how to participate in the process. And then the final point I'd like to make is I think we need to strongly consider allowing permanent residents to vote in municipal elections as a way to start easing their way into the political system. I mean, they're the property taxpayers, so why aren't they allowed to vote at least in municipal elections?
Everyone's making a plug today, so I'll make a plug for Ryerson University, because Sahar Shafiq spoke at a Ryerson democracy panel back in November where she talked about the Canadian Muslim vote, so that was a wise speaker to steal from Ryerson. Good for you. When I lived in Hong Kong, I got to vote as well after a few years there because you pay taxes. So let's turn to social media. I know all of you are active on social media, and you're also targeted by social media. And social media was supposed to change the world. It was supposed to bring us new kinds of transparency and democracy and connectivity. And then someone named Donald Trump came along. But even before Donald Trump and Twitter trolls and hostility, we were seeing, and before fake Facebook posts, we were seeing this fragmentation on Facebook where everybody was talking to themselves and it became an echo chamber, and it tended to make people a little more passive. Maybe you think you're involved by just clicking on a like, but that's as far as it goes, and no one's there to do the heavy lifting afterwards. And it also people tend to lose their impulse control on Twitter. They just say things they would never say. I mean, look how well behaved everyone is today when they're sitting side by side, as opposed to when they're two swords lengths apart in the legislature or when they're on the stump haranguing one another. So my first question to Ms. Wynne is, tell us about the good, the bad, and the ugly on social media and what to do about it in terms of engagement.
Just like that. Yeah. Well, I think, it's literally a double-edged sword, because you're right. The isolation, the anonymity, I think creates a lot of vicious back and forth that I don't think helps democracy. I don't think it helps any of the political discourse. But the flip side is that social media can spread an idea, can bring people together. I mean, we saw in the 2015 federal election that people could come together at the drop of a dime because of social media. So there's a democratizing effect that social media can have. My question, I go back to the question I asked before, how should we be using it? Because I didn't grow up with the social media that we have. With all due respect, nobody on this platform grew up with the technology that is available today, and so I really think we need to ask young people, how can we best use social media to engage you to engage us? What are the solutions there? I literally do not have them. We have teams of young people who are working on our team, in our party, but I really think it's going to be an important question that young people are going to have to work with us on. We can't assume that we're going to get the answers. And then the final thing I would say is that with all of that, with all of social media, there is nothing that takes the place of human interaction. And so whenever I hear in our campaign teams this notion that somehow we are going to substitute personal interaction with social media, I think it's additive. I think that it's in addition to the personal interaction, because that's where the real exchange happens. So I think that it is a tool, but it's not the answer to any of the questions that you've asked.
I'm trying to keep track of the time, so I'm going to go to Mr. Fedeli and ask you.
Quick then.
Pardon me?
And I'll be quick then.
And I'm just going to ask you about before fragmentation. We used to talk about big tent parties, where a party would involve everybody of a certain ideological bent including the environment. So before the Green Party came, all parties tried to reach out to the environment, including the Progressive Conservative Party under Bill Davis. So how do you wrestle with that issue of fragmentation versus big tent, especially in the last few years?
Well, look, when you talk about how this is reflected through social media, certainly when you think about the good, as the Premier talked about, think about Ukraine or Turkey or Egypt and all of the good that came out of that, and then think about Tiananmen Square in the before social media, and what would have happened in Tiananmen Square had there been social media. That's what I was thinking about on that when you talk about the good. The bad, of course, it brings out third parties who may be nefarious or mischievous. So that's, that we have to take the good with the bad with respect to that. But I think about, when I took a trip to India a couple years ago and met with Prime Minister Modi at his home, and he talked about holograms. And you talk about reaching out, Martin, and a big tent. He would have a hologram of himself where he can talk to millions at a time. So when we're saying to you, we want to listen to you, we hear what you're saying, and what the words you're using are technology. It's not, any other language but technology. And I think Prime Minister Modi nailed it when he taught us that, and maybe that's what we need to be doing.
People in the room want one of us as a hologram in your living room?
Oh, so it won't be me.
Ms. Horwath, actually, Mike Schreiner right beside you is a hologram. That's actually not.
Touch me. Am I real?
Okay, you've all been so incredibly engaged and engaging today. Let me ask you a bit of a trick question. Why can't you be like this all the time? Why can't you? No, it's actually a serious question, or a half-serious question. People say, this is a cliche, that people are turned off by negativity, by negative advertising, by name-calling, by criminalizing, and so on. So is it partly your fault, collectively, I'm not going to pick on anybody here, that maybe there's a different way to prosecute the issues instead of prosecuting each other? Ms. Horwath?
Your fault, Martin.
It's an interesting.
your fault.
It's an interesting point, Martin. But I mean, I think people become more cynical about politics when they see that people make promises and parties make promises, and then they get elected, and those promises don't get fulfilled, and then folks say, well, so why do I even bother to vote if the promises that are being made that I voted for are not going to get implemented? And that's what creates great disappointment, and that's what creates great cynicism. And so then you really can't blame people for saying, why should I bother? And I don't know about you, but there's also people who we'll hear it all the time. I mean, I certainly hear it all the time. Is all politicians are the same. They don't think that their vote is going to make a difference. And so what I believe, and I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning, I believe we have to give people something to vote for, something to get excited about, that real change can happen, that we can actually make a difference in people's lives and make things better for folks. That's what I think helps to motivate people. And I think there's a bit of a change sense in the air right now in Ontario, and I'm excited about that. I think it will impact positively our voter turnout in this coming election, and I think people will have some important choices to make. But I know that the negative advertising is something that folks get concerned about. So why don't we talk about some positive changes we can make for the future and inspire people to vote, give them something to vote for, something that they want to actually go to the polls to see happen, something positive.
I want to come at this a slightly different way. And I mean, when we talk to folks who were in the legislature years ago, they talk about a different tone. So I think you're talking about a polarization. I think you're talking about a broader political discourse change that has happened. And I'm going to make a hockey analogy, which my team will be very happy with. So I grew up in the era of 6 teams, and I can remember when the Philadelphia Flyers started to put a goon on the ice and fight. And the fighting is what has become, or did become, certainly for years, I think we might be going in the other direction now in hockey, but the light was shone on the fight and people waited for the fight to happen. And I think there's an element of that in what's happened in political culture, is that people are waiting for the fight. The media, with all due respect, likes the fight, is not necessarily interested in the good news, because Andrea talks about promises broken, but who writes about the promises that were kept? Who writes about the hundreds of policy initiatives that governments deliver on? It's not news, right? And so I think that culture of getting your blood up and getting your fists up, that is something, again,
That's the hockey analogy. Elbows up
we
in the
all have to
corners.
take responsibility for. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but that I think is part of it.
The other night I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out. It was quite a surprise.
Precisely.
I'm going to go into overtime with your permission for just a couple of minutes because we went a bit late and you opened the door to hockey. And talk about, first of all, I'm going to accept blame. Thank you for finally someone took a shot at the media, and deservedly so, because I do think we spend way too much time on the horse race, and I call it horse racism. And I just think we waste way too much time worrying about who's ahead and who's up and who's down, and not thinking about some of the issues. I'm going to do a quick until one of you tells me time's up. I'm going to spend just the last couple of minutes throwing out a couple of questions on you, and you got to be brief. You got to either duck or say yes or no. And online voting, Mr. Schreiner.
Too vulnerable.
When the technology is ready, then I think that we should be looking at it.
The PCs are doing it right now for our leadership convention, and I think it's very exciting.
When it's secure. Sorry.
So we asked a trick question when we did our poll. I did the wording because words are my business, and we said, "Do you support secure online voting?" And it was by a margin of roughly 68% in favor. 2/3 favored secure online voting. Did I say secure?
Yes. I just have to say something here, because I know, Vic, you talked about the onerous task of going to vote and standing in line with people who you don't know. I just have to say a little bit that I think we need to be careful about that, because it is a community activity. It is people coming together to do a collective thing. We don't have many collective activities now. If you think about it, where do we gather together to do something together? We come together to a concert maybe, but we don't, there isn't a town square in the same way that there used to be. We don't have those gathering places. So I would just say, let's be a little bit careful about doing away with the opportunity for people to take part in this democratic exercise together, whether you know the person standing next to you or not. That's probably better that you don't.
I'm going to call time.
Yes, sorry.
Mr. Fedeli.
But by doing that, though, only 50% are there. That's the issue. So
mix.
by not voting, they've already decided. They've made their decision.
This is a good issue. This is worth another hour in itself. Let me quickly ask you, though, mandatory voting, Mr. Schreiner. You get in Australia, you get fined $20 if you don't vote. By the way, in Ontario, you get fined if you don't fasten your seatbelt or serve on a jury or get your vaccinations. But Mr. Schreiner.
I don't think we need top-down rules that say you have to vote. Let's give people an incentive to vote.
Okay.
I think one of the incentives to vote is that your vote counts, which is why I would support electoral reform.
I'm going to fine you because it was a one-word answer.
Oh, okay.
So, Ms. Horwath. Mandatory voting.
I'd say inspiration, not punishment.
Good. Okay, Mr. Fedeli.
It's best served with a willing partner.
Okay.
I agree.
I'm in a minority. I'm in favor of it, but that's because I spent time in Australia. I think I'm going to wrap this up because
Hong Kong, I just want to get that out.
no, in Australia, in Hong Kong, there's other forms of compulsion, unfortunately, but and they're not really democratic. We are going to be back for another hour. In just a couple of minutes, we have some of the strategists who help to make these leaders shine. But I wanted to thank the leaders for coming here today. This has never been done before, and I think it's just been a fascinating learning experience for me, and I really appreciate it, and I think our audience has found this really educational as well. So thank you. Our MCs are going to...
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to the party leaders. And also thanks to the audience for being a great audience so far. The leaders will now be making their way out, and the panel of top strategists will be moving in, and they'll be here to take your questions.
Okay, if the next panelists could come towards the stage, and we'll begin shortly.
I
Hello again, and on behalf of the Faculty of Arts, welcome back to our Ryerson Democracy Forum. We are ready to start our Q&A session with the strategists representing each party. Just a gentle reminder, we're here today for a democracy forum, not an election debate, so please keep your questions on point.
Yeah, and so feel free to ask about anything that you've heard in the last hour from the leaders, or any questions you have about how to boost democratic engagement. Just raise your hands, and we will have a couple of volunteers who will find you with the microphones and hold them while you ask your question. Okay, let's introduce our panel and get started. And please hold any applause for now.
You already know our moderator, Toronto Star columnist Martin Regg-Cohn, who is a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Arts. Beside him is David Hurley, campaign director for the Ontario Liberal Party and a longtime party pollster and strategist federally and provincially. As a lawyer, he heads the Gandalf Group, a consulting firm.
Next to him is Alikan Velshi, Chief of Staff for the Progressive Conservative Party at Queen's Park. He is also a lawyer and has held senior positions for the previous Conservative governments in Ottawa and on past federal election campaigns. Beside him is Maurits Stiles, who was president of the New Democratic Party for past 2 years, and has worked for many years with the Ontario NDP on campaign strategy and research, in addition to being a local school trustee. And finally, on the far left, Taylor Horwath is on the provincial executive of the Green Party of Ontario and is chair of outreach and engagement for the 2018 election campaign.
And just one last time, remember when you're asking your questions, out of respect, do make sure that they are questions and not speeches. And with that, over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you, Grace and Aidan. So we just had a brainstorming session with the leaders, and now we have the brains behind the leaders, the Brain Trust, who are, in some cases, also not just strategists, but also gatekeepers for the parties. And so some of them helped to make not just their own appearance possible, but helped to make it possible for the leaders to appear. And so thank you on both counts for being here. So as the questioners are clearing their throats, I just have one round that I'm going to throw at the people on stage while you are ready, and raise your hands and the mic runners will come by. And I just wanted to ask, any thoughts about what you just heard? Did you hear any great solutions other than from your own party leader about what could change, move the dial?
First of all, can people hear me in the overflow room? No, I'm joking. I think it was a good conversation, but I think it was a happy, positive conversation, as they would all be naturally inclined to do. I don't know that it got into the really kinds of systemic alienations people are having from all institutions, including their democratic institutions right now. And I think that it quite easily got into a situation where if we just make this act a little easier, people will do it. And, I'm not sure that that's really the most important. I'm not sure the convenience is really the problem here.
I appreciated the civility of it. It's something that we don't often see amongst and between political parties, and I think that civility is something that is encouraging. And forums like these are, I think, good precisely because they encourage that sort of behavior. In terms of the ideas themselves, I mean, I think. Just to give one example, Premier Wynne made some very good points about the manner in which people vote and how it's a communal exercise. It's an opportunity to meet strangers. That's certainly something that you don't hear very often. And so I think they all of them made very good points, and the manner in which the dialogue took place, I think, encouraged that.
Marit?
Well, I mean, first of all, the format was fantastic. I hope that Mr. Paikin is taking notes here for any upcoming debates. I loved that. I thought that, it was so refreshing to hear everybody speak in a more collegial way and to have a real conversation. I thought that was fantastic. And I think if we had more conversations like that we'd actually have more people engaged. Because I do think that is part of what I hear. And I mean, I'm also a candidate right now, so I'm knocking on a lot of doors. And what I hear in terms of people's sense of lack of hope or despair or wanting not to engage in the process is more about, I think, the way that politics is conducted, but also about the failures that we've seen repeatedly. A sense that, this government promised one thing and didn't do it, or did something completely different that they didn't even tell us about. And I could be more specific. But that, I think, has actually really contributed to this disillusionment in the political process.
Taylor, you're doing outreach all the time for the Green Party. What did you hear today, other than from your own leader, that you thought might help move the dial?
Well, I do agree the format was fantastic. Being able to see people engage each other in a cordial way is rare in politics. So I'm very happy to see that, because I believe the youngest person on the panel, perhaps not, that it's one of the reasons why young people don't vote as well, is that we are not reflected in the legislature, as was mentioned, but also just it is alienating. We don't want to see people fighting all the time and not actually addressing the issues that matter. And so it is encouraging to see these kinds of formats, but at the same time, I agree with David, it's not a matter of inconvenience. It's about how are we engaging people. Is it about transactional action, or is it about collaborative action that we're seeing, the kinds of engagement that is happening? And the legacy of politics in this country has been transactional, not collaborative. And so we're seeing now we're having to change our behaviors as engagers and politicians, because it's time to build the trust and to build communities that are outside of just the traditional norms that we see, the traditional faces that we see in politics.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to take the hint from Taylor and ask, is there a young person who has a question that they want to ask of the panel? I saw the first hand go up. You're the winner. Yes.
Hi. So my question has a lot to do with how it makes you feel. So this past Sunday, a very close friend of mine died of apparent suicide on Highway 400. He never showed me his noticeable signs of depression, never spoke about how he may have felt. My question is, what kind of initiatives are parties willing to pursue to destigmatize the issue of mental health and provide more resources for those that need it?
Okay. I'm going to let anyone at the panel answer, but we're trying to keep the focus on democratic engagement, but does anyone want to respond to that?
I'm thank you for that, and I'm very sorry. I think that one of the things that our party has been talking about, and I believe there'll be more details coming out with the platform, is actually, though, having a ministry that specifically deals with mental health. And I know as a school board trustee that we have, as far as I'm concerned, an epidemic of anxiety and depression in our schools. So one of the things that I know I've spoken with Andrea about and that we've talked quite a lot about is the need to start putting more resources into schools and universities, but particularly social workers, school psychologists, folks that are going to be working from the time you're in JK right up through to make sure that you have some of the coping mechanisms and the support that you need. So I think it's a massive conversation and increasingly important.
Thanks for that question. And I have covered some politicians at university town halls, and it is a recurring question, absolutely. Yes, right over here.
Hi there. So in the last discussion, you talked a lot about getting students to vote, so youth generally, but specifically students that are studying at an institution that might be different from their home writing. And one of the best parts of the 2015 federal election on-campus polls were that students could vote in their home riding at that campus poll or for the riding that they were studying in. And so I was curious about how parties can target that demographic, given that we don't know which one they're going to vote in, especially in June, which is kind of a toss-up. What is the party strategy to get that cohort out voting, especially when you don't know where they are?
And please answer that question, but as an afterthought, is Elections Ontario doing enough? Because you're quite right. Elections Canada led the charge on that, and I'm not aware if it's been as active on campus voting or any issue, but Mr. Hurley, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to slam Elections Ontario, at least not on this particular issue. You know, I think it's different if the election falls within a school year, and this one doesn't. So I don't know that they can be particularly faulted. I think that everybody who's in politics and running campaigns looks at elections in which youth turnout has surged or been unusually high, such as, for instance, 2008 Obama or 2015 Trudeau, and has seen the way that can change the electorate and has seen the way that that can change outcomes of races. So I presume that there's nobody on this stage who isn't thinking about how to get young people out to vote pretty consistently. And, you know, from my perspective, I would riff off the previous conversation and say it's partly sort of physical, tactile engagement in that all of us are developing very significant online operations, very significant data operations, very significant social media operations, specifically to try to engage with young people in the electorate. And secondly, I think it's a matter of whether or not you have issues, whether or not you have something to say that is going to appeal to young people. Not that they're monolithic and not that it has to be simplified down to marijuana. I think there's a much broader range of issues that people are concerned about. But my take on the entire previous conversation is that fundamentally people who aren't voting because they don't think it matters whether they do or not. And I think that that's particularly true of young people.
I think that the timing of the upcoming provincial election in June creates a certain complexity when it comes to ensuring that students are able to vote. But ultimately, you know, the challenge of all political parties is to find a way to attract people to their platform. And so there are a specific set of issues that I think are of concern to students, to young professionals, to other youth. And it's the job of every political party to identify those issues and to speak to those issues. And you know, different parties will have different perspectives on that. And so parties are going to turn their mind to that, and then they're going to turn their mind to the mobilization strategy and on ways to do that. And I think David was quite right. Those elections where youth turnout has been high have been precisely because of the salience of issues of particular concern to youth.
But are there any trade secrets that you and David can share in terms of how you are going to mine youth data in some way, some secret way that you're going to tell us about today?
I mean, look, I'll be honest. I don't think you should treat young people as being in this special sort of sandbox where you speak to them differently than you speak to everyone else, right? You know, like I may not be the youngest person on this panel, but certainly amongst my peer group of sort of young professionals, you know, it's jobs, it's flexibility in the workplace, it's affordable family formation, it's housing, it's mental health, which we're all touched by in many different ways, and those are issues that affect all segments of the population, but they affect them in different ways. And I think it's finding a way to identify how you address those for students and younger voters. And so there's no real trade secret other than the fact that it's such a large cohort of the population that is not voting as high as other cohorts, that the parties that are able to kind of unlock that not only will be doing good for themselves electorally, but they'll be doing good for the province.
Mara, David, any follow-up?
Far from having a trade secret, I have a knowledge deficit. And I'm not the youngest person on this panel, I'm by far the oldest person on this panel. And I'm the least familiar with social media. And here's my challenge as a campaigner, talking to young people, dealing with young people, is I've got a complicated story to tell about a lot of issues. It's a government that's been in office for 15 years. There's nothing simple about explaining what it's done. It's a complicated story. I'm told that young people consume all their information on this device. I'm told that they only watch 7 seconds of video, and I'm told that they do that with the sound off. And so I am trying to understand how I can tell a complicated story to people watching 7 seconds of no audio video. If I came out of here learning anything, that's what I would love to learn from you people.
Have had far too much politics by polling. We've had too much, and I think I agree a little bit with my colleagues here to some extent. Sorry?
You're going right at me.
I know. Holster. But in so much as, we think, as you're pointing out, that, if we just talk about tuition, that's going to cover the bases with university students, when in fact the issues are much more complex. And the only way we know what they are is to actually engage and listen. And to that point, I think what we are heading toward, at least I hope what we're headed toward, is a more collaborative process of policymaking and decision-making that allows for all voices to be heard. And absolutely, the issues that you face as students here and others who work in the university are much more complex. We live in an extraordinarily expensive city. We don't have the choices to live necessarily near where we study or work. And so the issues that you face are not so different in many ways from the communities that you're living in and coming from. But I think that too often that's how politics has shifted into these little grab bag of goodies that are supposed to target certain communities, youth, seniors, et cetera, instead of understanding that it's a little bit more dynamic than that.
Taylor, I'm guessing the Green Party, unlike the three major parties, does a lot less polling. Any thoughts about that last question?
Of course. So I am still a student myself, although I have just recently completed all my studies. My degree has been conferred, but I have not crossed the stage, so I'm not ready to give up my student status yet. So I do understand, and I disagree that with the ideas that students are facing something that is, yes, there is overlap in the issues, but what I think the issue is for young people and young people that are looking for whoever is going to form government is, are you investing in our future? I know for myself, finding stable work and having thousands of dollars of debt is a huge issue. And I see you nodding because you agree that what is the province doing to invest in our future? And it's sort of, what are the solutions that we have? What does each party have going forward to say that we do listen to you and we do hear you when we're knocking on doors and trying to make that connection, and we are investing in your future, whether that be in education, whether that be in climate change. If we don't have a habitable planet, political discussions are mute, right? So what are we going to do going forward, listening to young people and really getting real with the issues, right?
David has in a sense answered your question with a question by saying, how do I get that message across? And Taylor took a stab at it. And you were nodding, I saw, as David was describing his challenge. Question over there. Yeah, you got it. Yeah. Lightning fast hand raising.
So my question is kind of twofold. It's relating to what we've seen with disinformation and botting on the internet and what we've seen through the Russian collusion investigation in the US. So it's twofolded in the sense of, what are we doing to fight disinformation and antagonism on the internet and so on in the coming election, but also, are we doing enough to fight it in the future after the election, right? We see the federal government cozying up kind of with Facebook, and it's like, are we doing enough, and what are we going to be doing until June? Thank you.
Anyone? Alec?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it's a huge issue, and the answers to that are not obvious at all. And You know, if you try to look behind and try to figure out what is behind some of these online operations, it's a little obscure and opaque and not easy to find out. I think that Facebook, in the remarks recently about what went on in the United States, has shown that they don't take this issue seriously at all, and are not serious about cleaning it up. I think for the purposes of this election, I just have to assume it's that hostile world out there. There's 2 months to go before the campaign. I think that afterwards, there's a lot of time to think about how we might clean things up and how, excuse me, I'm going to sneeze, how things might be structured differently in the future, but nothing's going to happen in the next 2 months in terms of that. And I assume it is going to be a hostile online world, and it's buyer beware in terms of information out there. I think that, you know, Martin's been encouraging people to trash the media, but I actually, in this context, am a huge advocate of people looking to what remains of serious journalists being edited and fact-checked and what they are reporting and saying. And if you see something online that doesn't come from a source that you automatically believe that about, try to find another source before you jump to any conclusion.
With David, that you know, it's very important that we hold journalists to a high standard and give them credit where credit is due. I also think we should be critical of the fact the relationship between politics and the media, and that they have to work collaboratively to sort of address this issue. That, you know, sometimes it is advantageous for smear campaigns or for misinformation to circulate, and that's a problem. And so the only way that we can address it is by having the whole political community, the whole political arena address the issue.
Media, sorry, what? Sorry, what was the problem? The collaboration? I just couldn't hear the last bit.
The issue is essentially that the media and politicians themselves in the political arena should work collaboratively to address this issue. It shouldn't be much, as was saying in the previous panel, is the sort of the way politics is done is just sort of a fight, and so that it's advantageous for some people, advantageous for some individuals and some parties for this misinformation to circulate, and we are seeing that in the United States.
Alika?
You know, I sometimes feel like I'm actually part of the problem as a young person, in the sense that I get all of my information online. I can't think of the last time I paid for a newspaper. I go out of my way to avoid paying for any sort of content, and that's been the case since university. And so,
spoken to your leader lately?
And so let me even go further. And so, you know, the traditional media, you know, is basically, you have these brands with established reputations and, you know, high costs of production, and out of that you kind of get this relationship of trust with them, because, you know, if they mislead you, the value of the brand is eroded, right? And I'm not at all part of that world in terms of getting content from that world. I get my news online, and right, it's free news, and because I like free. I don't like paying for stuff. And so the challenge you have then is that there are bad actors. There are bad actors who either make it seem like they're providing news, but really they're providing kind of entertainment or and clickbait. Or they're bad actors because, you know, they're controlled by foreign powers and they're trying to erode trust within kind of Western democracies by deliberately and maliciously spreading fake news. And so the moment you make the decision, as I guess I have, to get the bulk of your news online and on social media, you're now operating in this murky world where bad information is sometimes crowding out good information. And so what can you do about it? I mean, I agree with David that, you know, Facebook's not doing enough. I'm not sure I would empower or trust government to be sort of the filter for this. I'm not sure we can go back to sort of, you know, the good old days where there was sort of, you know, 2 or 3 newspapers and you just get all your information from them. All you can really do, I suppose, is given that, you know, we're in sort of this networked world, you trust information that is put before you from people or brands that you trust, and you sort of, you hope that you get quality from volume.
There is one thing you can do, Ali Khan, and that is to follow your leader and buy the Toronto Star print edition. And for students here, I believe you can get the print edition on campus free almost anywhere. So there is a remedy that the panel has helped me come up with.
Liberal, let me say, please buy the Toronto Star.
And read Martin.
Was so civilized, but you see, the brain trust has completely.
Yeah. Take one thing from the last panel, though, important in this conversation, which is all the talk about civility. Maybe one of the ways to combat fake news online is to ask yourself, are you really prepared to believe the worst of people who disagree with you? Are you really prepared to believe anything about them? Because there's a lot of reasons why people could have decided that Hillary Clinton shouldn't be the President of the United States, but the fact that she's running a pedophile ring under a pizza joint is not one of them, right? And yet millions of people apparently believe that to be true. And in order to believe that to be true, you have to be willing to believe the very, very worst is possible out of these people. And let me just say that regardless of who is running in the election in June, none of them are going to be terrible people, right? And so just be careful about what you're prepared to believe about them.
Questions? Yeah. There's a person at the very back with a hand up. Yes.
I am a student at Ryerson University, and I will be graduating from the Early Childhood Studies program, and I am concerned about my future, earning potential in this field. The median wage for a registered early childhood educator is $17.29 an hour, and there's few jobs with benefits, pension plans, and paid programming time. I want to hear your ideas for raising ECE wages without impacting parent fees and without depending on precarious stopgap policies like the wage enhancement grant.
Okay. Avoiding precarious labor with special job enhancements?
Just the last phrase you said, I didn't hear.
Wage enhancing grants.
I was basically mentioning that I wanted to have this issue, like, I guess, hold on, let me just read that again. I want to hear that what your ideas are for raising ECE wages without impacting parent fees and without depending on the stopgap policies like wage enhancement grants.
Do you want to go? Go ahead, absolutely. No, go.
No, because I have to say thank you for that extraordinarily important question. It is, without doubt, the number one issue that's raised with me on doorsteps in my community. And I say that because there's so many young families in my community, clearly, because once you're past that point, which I am thankfully past in my life, and you don't have to pay those childcare fees anymore, you're not really thinking about it so much. But the truth is, it is devastating for many people, and the government has thrown a lot of money at subsidized spaces, which is great. But there are a whole lot of people caught in between who don't qualify for subsidies and cannot afford full-time childcare spaces, and our system is not built to actually provide real care for kids in that situation. And our childcare workers are criminally underpaid. So, I mean, I'm just going to say right off the bat, thank you, that there is, in my opinion, and I think our party has been pretty straightforward on this for a long time now in a number of elections, the answer is $15 a day childcare. If Quebec can do it, we can do it, and just look at the BC budget and how they're tackling this issue. It really comes down to political will. And you're absolutely right. Childcare providers should not have to be bearing the brunt of that, as well as the parents who have to pay the fees. So thanks for that.
As well, I do understand, personally, I just completed a Master of Social Work, so I'm going into a similar field and understand the trepidation around finding work that'll pay you and pay you a living wage. To answer your question as best I can, without getting too political about things, right? In terms of, to make this about engagement and whatnot. I do agree that I would like to see a provincial childcare strategy as well. That is something that the Green Party supports. But these are the kinds of things that are important to hear. The personal stories of individuals, right? It's okay for the chair of outreach and engagement to say that as an individual, but also the people that we're talking to, hearing the stories about not only am I strapped with a ton of debt coming out of school, how am I going to pay this off, and how am I going to even think about entering the housing market or saving up for my future. These are all larger issues that we need to keep hearing from individuals, because this is how you shape policy. And yes, it is directly tied to how you cast your ballot on June 7th. But at the same time, thereafter, it's keeping engaged. One of the ways, to answer the question that was sort of asked a little bit before, one of the ways to engage young people as well is, on-campus clubs. And so there are, Greens, there are NDPs and PCs and Liberals that organize at the college and university level elsewhere. But these are young people that have real life experience of what it's like to be a young person. And there are also communities, clubs and societies on campuses that are specifically culturally based. And there are also individuals that have an idea of what it's like to have a specific issue or a specific concern. And engaging and outreaching those groups is so important. And having candidates, having leaders visit colleges and universities to hear people speak these sorts of concerns. It was a question, but it was also there was a message in there, and that's important to hear, for all of us to hear.
Else, David?
Yeah, I have to say I couldn't agree with you more in terms of what you said. I'd like to say that our government's done a lot of things in that area in terms of improving the wages of personal support workers and in encouraging early childhood education and all that, but I don't want to turn it into that kind of conversation. What I'd like to say to you is I agree with you a lot, and I think it's actually part of a broader conversation that is long overdue, but is probably, ironically, going to be brought on to us by automation in other parts of the workforce, which is whether it's childcare, early learning and education, whether it's elder care and taking care of senior citizens, whether it's taking care of somebody with a disability. We systemically undervalue care in this society of all kinds. We don't appreciate the burden it takes on people. We don't pay people who do it enough. And frankly, I think in the coming conversation that we're all going to have about what the nature of work is, in a world in which technology and automation takes away a lot of existing labor and work, one of the conversations we're going to have is what's care worth, and how much are we prepared to value that? So,
response to that. Sorry, I don't want to. But when you think of this issue in relation to why is it that childcare? I mean, yes, governments make little changes here and there, but as an issue in an election, it's never really gets there to the point where we think it's worth, going the whole way to like a $15, provincial childcare program or something. And why is it that we struggle so hard to make issues like childcare, put them at the forefront? And the reason is that, again, it is because it's largely women's work. Right? And it has been. And so we are, it's not just a struggle out there for this, it's a struggle to put that as women in politics at the front of the agenda. And I think that's something that we're seeing change, perhaps. But the other reason is that once people stop having their babies, it's not an issue as much again, right? We have other issues. And we forget, again, those people that are the ones who are largely bearing the brunt, which is the workers.
Okay, good question and interesting answers. I owe somebody over here. I think this person in front, I owe him, and then you're next, right behind him. Yes.
Hi, thanks. My name is Aaron Hiltz. I work for the Lakehead University Student Union in Aurelia. Come quite a long way. So being a student leader on campus, I can tell you firsthand that most students feel horribly underrepresented. Whether it be skyrocketing tuition fees, accessing services like mental health and support networks on campus, many of us are left in the dark. So my question is, as much as you folks might be available for students in the GTA, what are your plans to help get the youth back involved in the rural communities of Northern Ontario?
Okay, and David, a memo to file that not only are people looking at their smartphones for that 7-second commercial, they're also reading their questions from their smartphone. So, anyone?
Well, are you talking about engagement in this election or engagement in the longer term? So is a club the way to do that? If I could actually just turn this into a dialogue for a second. Like at the federal level, the Liberal Party has totally changed its structure and membership format to eliminate membership in the party. It used to be that you paid money and you became a member of the Liberal Party. That's gone now at the federal level, and you just decide online whether you're a supporter or not. You claim to be a supporter, and the theory behind that was that young people these days weren't interested in joining organizations like that. They would lend their moral authority and support to something when they believed in it, but they wanted to be able to retract it when they didn't. And they didn't feel like that whole insiderish, I'm a member, I've got a card in my pocket, and that gives me status over anybody else. That wasn't the way things worked anymore. So, you know, I'd love to give my candidates in Thunder Bay advice about how they should be reaching out to young people at Lakehead University, but is it through a club or is it through some other format? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I think it's through one-on-one interaction. So as much as we know as students that students don't vote as much, candidates know that as well. So when approaching candidates, a lot of the time we get this kind of, oh, like, I'll listen to you for 3 seconds, but you don't vote. So we move along. But we're seeing differences in that. Elizabeth Van Hoop, who's the Simcoe North candidate, is actively involved. She emails me all the time. We talk about sitting down with students, roundtable discussions. I think she has a really good advantage there when it comes to being present on campus. So, and like I said, like, we don't see much of that through any other parties, and it's few and far between other communities.
I was.
Tell us about it.
I mean, I was a member of a conservative campus club, but I think the problem you identify is a real one, which is that the focus of the government of Ontario is, it almost like it's once you get north of the 401, it's just this sort of this hinterland, and that's how it feels like to me. And certainly when I speak to a number of our MPPs, they say the same thing. And so the challenge is severalfold, right? It's not just, it's recognizing that Ontario is more than just, you know, south of Eglinton, right? It's more than just downtown Toronto. And it's recognizing that the needs of on campus are different depending on the sort of the communities you live in. And I think there's a lot that can be said about that. All I'll say is that I think robust campus clubs, whether it's an NDP club, whether it's a PC club, and robust student unions are good for a number of reasons. They're good because they're a forum that allows students as individuals to interact with political parties and political actors and kind of represent their views. They're good because they're kind of a breeding ground for talent, right? I would say that my involvement in a campus club was in many ways kind of the first rung on the ladder of kind of upward political mobility. I wasn't networked in conservative politics until I started on my campus club. And so I think that these sort of political involvements on campus help network people, and kind of the robustness of these institutions actually have this kind of a good outside. But yeah, no, I agree entirely with the premise of your question.
Interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Your answer, Mara, that's why I asked. I sort of suspected you might have been a young Tory, but I mean that as a compliment, because you were engaged and you were involved. But is it to groom a cadre of party activists and future leaders, or is it to actually engage the large student body at large, which I suspect was David's point? Mara, what do you think?
I think it's very, I mean, I remember I was not actually a member of my university NDP club, although that is how I met my partner eventually. He was. then I got involved. But I was like I'm going to date myself now, but I was very active in like various causes and organizing around issues like anti-apartheid and stuff like that. That's, I think, another thing. I mean, young people are often, very engaged, but maybe not just in a political party. And so, and now I'm forgetting your question.
Idea of campus clubs and student engagement.
And well, yeah, and so, but I always thought it was interesting from when I was in university and now looking and working with, U of T, NDP, and Ryerson NDP and stuff like that, I don't know that the reasons that people get involved in different clubs, different political party clubs, are the same. I think that maybe the reason you join the NDP is different. I don't know, but I feel like a lot of times our New Democrat activists in the clubs are very activist on other issues, and maybe that's true of other clubs as well. And I was just...
environmentalists who might be migrating to the Green Party sometimes.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And I think that, though I guess what I was going to say is that if I was a candidate, I think that's great that that candidate is coming to you and reaching out to you. I would also want to see my candidate out there coming to the events and the activities that are planned more broadly at the university, and also showing up for the actions and talking about the issues like the number of professors who are on contract, things like that also affect life in university. Yeah.
Just briefly, Taylor, because I do want to give other questioners a chance. Did you join a campus Green Club or the Green Party at large?
Green Party at large. Because I actually ran for the first time when I was 24 years old. I had been with the party for a month, and I said precisely, I don't see my values or myself reflected in the politics in Ontario, so I'm going to run. That was the first time I ran, was in 2011. But thank you so much for your question. I also am a fellow student government leader. I'm the Vice President of Finance at Carleton, so Carleton University for the Graduate Students Association. So I understand your struggle. I think throughout the year, if I can put it on you as well, because I understand your struggle so much, is to have engagement throughout the year from the MPP, to come and speak or come and be part of a panel or come and meet students. Why does it have to be an election cycle, right? Why can they not make time to sit down and talk with us and have community engagement? That's a big issue, right?
Yeah,
and
the university is essentially a community within it.
Yeah.
Before you get that microphone, before you get your hands on that microphone, I'm going to, but Ali Khan wanted to make a quick point.
Go to your point, I do think that it's a struggle that I think all political campus clubs face, which is to what extent are they vehicles for promoting the electoral prospects of their province-wide or their central party, versus to what extent are they kind of vehicles to explore, kind of intellectually explore different strands of the ideology underlying it. I know that in my conservative campus club, we had a fairly hostile relationship to the political party, and it was more sort of kind of tiny Tory fights between libertarians and social conservatives and other things. Different campus clubs do it differently, but I think these are like healthy debates, and it's good to get them done when you're in university.
We had two student leaders talking to each other here. Thanks for the question. Okay, that was one right behind that I promised, and then we'll go to you after that. And then this side.
We've heard some interesting ideas advanced about voting, and I think voting is important, but when it comes to democratic engagement, it's so much more than that. And so people vote for a whole number of reasons. They have a problem, they have something they care about, and then they realize that voting for someone is a rather crude way of addressing that problem. And after the election, that's it. They don't feel that they have any influence. So my question relates to, does our system allow for people to be involved from election to election throughout? And are there any changes that need to be made so people can actually have feel like they're making a difference on what government's doing? That's my question.
Good question, because it's often asked. Democracy is not just about elections, it's between elections in every sense. Anyone want to grab that question? Why don't you go first?
I think there's lots of interesting work happening, especially at the municipal level, around sort of collaborative decision-making and participatory budget processes and things like that, which I think we could learn a great deal from. And hopefully we could start to see some of that at the provincial, maybe even federal level. I have to say, because I haven't had a chance to say it yet, use this as an opportunity to say that I think that another way to make our political system work in a way that is more relevant to many people would be to actually have a real electoral reform. and to have the guts and the political will to bring that forward.
I can say that I think people who care about public policy have to find the right home for them, and some people, and there's nothing wrong with this, are disengaged enough that they're perfectly happy casting a ballot quadrennially, and then that's it, right? And then if they don't like what they've seen 4 years later, they'll vote for someone else. Others are probably more like myself and want to shape public policy by being kind of a staffer. Others enter the media because they want to maintain the ability to speak truth to power from the outside and say exactly what they think when they want to say it. And so what I've found over the years kind of working in different places on the margins of politics is there's many different ways to get involved between elections, and they're not well publicized. They're not the sort of things where you have like a job opportunity that's posted online, but there are a lot of ways of getting involved. And the key, I think, if you're a student, is I would actually say figure out which party you support, join the campus club just to learn about those opportunities, and then try a bunch of them out. And then over time, I think you will, as I have, find the right home for you, which allows you to express your influence between elections in the way that you're most comfortable with.
David?
I think that there are lots of ways for people who want to influence public policy between elections to do that. Inside a political party is one of those ways. It demands, to be effective at that, it demands a certain level of commitment to the overall enterprise of the success of that political party for you to be influential within it. So you can't be a tourist in a political party and really be influential in it, because one of the purposes of the political party is to get elected. And so if people don't think that you're interested in that particularly, then your advice as your influence as an insider is going to be relatively limited. But if you do see yourself falling broadly within the rubric of one of the political parties, that is ultimately where this stuff all gets synthesized. You can opt out of that, and you can get involved in the issue advocacy, of which there's a million ways to do that now, and those things are influential in an indirect way. So the policy ideas percolate up and get socialized and become acceptable over time, or the demand for them rises over time. Things come on the radar of political parties through that kind of exercise. But it is ultimately inside these political parties up here where these ideas get synthesized, where the trade-offs between one set of ideas and another set of ideas, where the very real decisions about resource allocation that have to go on in the creation of any government budget or any platform document, where people have to say, all these things are good, how much money are we putting toward this? How much money are we putting toward that? That's where those decisions get made. So those are ultimately and then you get confronted, then you get presented with 3 or 4 or 5 choices that you have to choose from in a menu. And as Jamie Watt likes to say, you don't get to choose a little from column A and a little from column B. You got to choose one of those menu items that's been put to you. So I know that it's quite conventional now to deride the role of political parties in the policy creation and formation process, but I think that is incorrect.
It's an interesting answer, and Ali Khan was nodding in a collegial way, because that is a part of the politics and economics of any political party. Is you've got to make those compromises. You can't just be for childcare. You have to have a view on renewable energy as well and how they interact. There was a question that I promised over there. Yes.
Because we're talking about student issues and democracy, my question is around tuition fees. What will each party be doing to address the upfront cost of education? The Ontario Student Grant has been helpful for some students. However, a lot of students aren't getting support still. Does your party support publicly funded education that is free for all students?
And I'm going to ask the panelists to give a very quick answer, because it's a little off topic of democratic engagement. So anybody who wants to bite. Quickly.
No, I don't think we do. I think that we have brought in a very, very strong program that under $100,000 of household income makes tuition effectively free through the changes that this government's made to OSAP. We've seen we've seen admissions soar in previously underrepresented groups like Aboriginal, Indigenous students. Enrollment was up 36%, I believe, in the first year of this program. But free for everybody, you'd be helping an awful lot of people that don't need help in that regard. I can see some issues around debt relief for higher income, higher middle class students, but I don't believe in making tuition free for people who could and should be able to afford it.
I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative here because it was an off-topic question. Thanks for that answer. Yes, right over there.
Well, sir, I'm the only bad apple.
Correct. Yeah, you spoke. You said it all.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a student here at Ryerson doing my master's, and I have a question about a topic that hasn't really been touched on at all, and it's in regards to what each party's position is or perspective on better engaging with First Nations communities in Ontario, and given that there's so many issues that are affecting First Nations youth, with the understanding that these kind of these communities, they have their own level of self-governance, self-autonomy, traditions, customs, laws, practices. So maybe participating in our idea of a democratic process isn't necessarily always very appealing to them, but given with the Truth and Reconciliation, it is important that we work on how to engage and build those relationships. So I just would like to hear from each person on that, or maybe not each, but.
Good question, and if you can think about Indigenous engagement in particular.
So in my master's in social work, I had a phenomenal professor who was an Indigenous leader in Ottawa, and her recommendation was you take the leadership as it comes to you. You listen to you listen first and foremost, and as opposed to going in there and going into communities and pretending like you know what you're doing. And the same thing goes for research, for example, and going into communities and taking out research and taking out resources. If I put my master's hat on, it's the same sort of idea, right? So this is a really uncomfortable moment right now for a number of reasons. There's so much change and there's so much flux that it's hard to know what the right thing to do is. But
the other panelists, because we're running out of time, so.
I think that, obviously, like, we could talk more about, like, nation to nation and what that means and the path that was being, I think, brought forward to us already. But I think that, in terms of engaging in elections and electoral politics, my goodness, if you want to talk about communities that should feel and do feel marginalized from our electoral system for a number of reasons, but most importantly because they have been so ignored and so neglected and had no real voice. And I think the way to do that is to do what elected officials like Charlie Angus do, which is to actually truly be an advocate in Parliament, and to also make sure that we have more Indigenous leaders running. And I think, as Andrea pointed out, like, we are doing a really big job of trying to actually recruit Indigenous candidates. But I mean, in terms of how those nation to nation, government to government relations, I think that's a whole other important discussion. And at the federal NDP convention a couple weeks ago, and it's still online, there was an amazing panel on nation to nation, which I highly recommend viewing.
Any others? Okay, one last question. Yes, over there, in the purple, yes.
So I'm here with the Ryerson Campus Conservatives. A few of our executives are here, and this is a question that I think we debate a lot, and it's given the recent incidents and debates kind of surrounding free speech on campus, whether it be in this province, this country, or in other Western societies. Many young people are afraid to speak their minds or challenge the mainstream ideas of their life or their social group, depending where they are. And I was wondering what you guys' thoughts and feelings are about the current state of free speech on college campuses today.
The current state of, sorry?
Of free speech on college campuses today, given, let's say, the Lindsay Shepherd situation at Laurier.
Ali Khan, this goes to you.
Let me begin by saying I had no, it's not a planted question. I wasn't given a heads up. It actually wasn't. The reason why, notwithstanding that I asked to kind of speak first is because, so I went to university, my undergrad was in the UK, it wasn't in Canada, but free speech issues were one of probably the reason that moved me to the right. That is to say, my family was liberal, right? We're from North Toronto, my great uncle was a liberal MPP, and I went to university being very political, but not having a political home kind of anywhere in the spectrum. And at the time, there was a move to suppress a speaker on campus, which I just didn't understand, right? I just sort of, in kind of the naivete of my youth, I just sort of said, well, good ideas will crowd out bad ideas, and whatever, let him say what he wants to say, and then, we can just debate it and ignore it. And so the hostility to that position is the reason why I first kind of expressed initial sympathy with kind of center-right ideas, and it was through that I kind of learned about the rest. I haven't been on campus as a student now in like a decade, so I'm not in a position to really say anything intelligent about the environment on campuses today. However, my strong view is that, universities are places to debate ideas, and sometimes ideas make you uncomfortable. The way to deal with that is to to confront it and debate it. And so just my assumption is that, what's the point of a university if you're not going to debate an idea you disagree with?
Unless anybody has anything more profound to add to that, this is probably a good time to wrap up, but quickly, Taylor, yes.
I don't think the free speech issue it is very polarizing, but I don't see it as being the issue that it is, right? As far as I'm concerned, free speech can be a cover for people to say things that don't make people uncomfortable, but attack people's identity and who they are and what they believe in, and undermine their identity. And so I don't agree free speech as a cover when you're harming individuals. I don't think that is an okay thing to do. And that's the social worker in me speaking, that no way should free speech be a cover for people to say whatever they want about whomever they want.
Thank you. And that's actually, this topic is a good way to end. Thank you for the question. And before we wrap up, I just want to, first of all, quickly thank the panelists for agreeing to come on and for being almost as civil as the political leaders who preceded you. No, but seriously, it was great to have this exchange of views and some tough topics. A couple of you made some plugs. I need to make a very quick plug before you go. If you are a political junkie, and I assume many of you are, the Faculty of Arts is sponsoring a great panel next week on how governments build budgets and how parties build and push out platforms. We're going to have 3 very senior, top, in fact, public servants in Ontario appearing. It's going to be a week tomorrow, and you can read about it on the Ryerson calendar. I'll be moderating that, so please come. Before I turn it over to our student MCs, Aiden and Grace, I just want to give a quick shout out to Charmaine McKenzie, who is the Director of Operations, among other things, in the Faculty of Arts, who did all the heavy lifting that took place in the last 2 hours and was an amazing help in all of this. And did all that for the Faculty of Arts, which is our host today. And I'm going to introduce in a moment the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Dr. Pam Sugiman, who, through her support behind this initiative many months ago, when it was coming together and then falling apart and then coming together again, and it was really a credit to Ryerson, which is driving the debate on democracy in Canada, and I think on democratic engagement. And you've seen an example of that today over the last 2 hours. So I'm going to ask Dr. Sugiman to say a quick formal thank you to the panelists and everyone who came today.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's my pleasure to close this event. I'd like to thank all of the party leaders and their strategists for taking time out of what must be extremely demanding schedules and participating in this conversation today. I'd also like to thank our president, Mohamed Lashmi, for joining us and providing a warm welcome to all. And my gratitude also goes to Martin. And I realize I've been mispronouncing your name all this time. Martin Reg Kahn. And Martin has brought this very timely and engaging dialogue to our campus. Months ago, Martin introduced the idea to me, the idea of this event today, characterizing it as a non-debate debate. And at the time, I was a bit perplexed about what he had in mind, but intrigued. I loved the premise, and I'm deeply impressed at how he has pulled it off. And as you know, Martin is incredibly resourceful and bright and savvy. Last, as Martin mentioned, but certainly not least, speaking of smart and savvy, I'd be remiss in not acknowledging our own incredible arts team, Charmaine McKenzie and Julia Davidova in particular. They've brought their A game to this event, as they do to every event that they plan. With just months until the provincial election, it's more important than ever to encourage all Ontarians to exercise their democratic right to vote. And having said this, as was pointed out by someone in the audience, I recognize that voting is one way in which we express our democratic engagement. As the discussion today suggests, democratic engagement is about being aware and informed on both content and process. As well, the realm of democratic engagement extends beyond electoral politics into family households, into child care centers, into neighborhoods, into city streets, schools and universities, workplaces, and the criminal justice system. Democratic engagement is at the heart of much of the work we do here in the Faculty of Arts. And I think of the soon-to-be-filled Jaroslawski Chair in Democracy, the recently established Democratic Engagement Exchange, the migration of John Beebe from Samara, Canada, to us in the Faculty of Arts as Senior Advisor on Democratic Engagement, and of course we share with the Faculty of Community Services, the Jack Layton Chair in Democracy, and the Unifor Chair in Social Justice and Democracy. And all of this activity is inspired by the belief that we need to bring together academic research with community engagement. We need to recruit new voices to the democracy space, many of which have been previously marginalized, some of them newcomers, some of them racialized people who have been in this country for generations. We need to think about the process and potential outcomes of democratic engagement. Thank you very much for joining us today in this conversation.
We would like to personally thank the student body here tonight. Thank you all for getting involved and participating. I think this is obviously a step in the right direction. And that being said, we would like to extend that thanks to Pamela Sugiman and the Faculty of Arts for making this event possible and allowing for Ryerson students to get engaged and get involved. Thanks again to Martin for mediating this event, and thank you to the party leaders and strategists for speaking. And a final thank you to my wonderful co-host, Grace.
Nous aimerions dire un très grand merci à tout le monde qui a pu venir aujourd'hui. Thank you to my co-host Aiden. Thank you to everybody who helped organize this. And everybody take care and have a great evening.